The Bohr model thus appeared to be wildly successful, and combined with de Broglie's insights, the atom now became a positively charged nucleus surrounded by negatively charged waving electrons. But, as was often the case, there were a few problems. First of all, the model utterly failed when it attempted to reproduce the spectra of atoms with more than one electron. The search for a general principle that would allow physicists to predict and explain the motions of electrons within atoms would have to continue. Additionally, it combined classical and quantum ideas in a somewhat disorganized mesh. With de Broglie's hypothesis, further steps could be taken away from the classical paradigm, but it still wasn't enough. It was still a classically orbiting electron that just happened to have a wavelength. Further, the model provided no insight as to what happens during a transition between energy levels, and it predicted that the ground state of hydrogen would contain a magnetic dipole moment, which doesn't happen. Meanwhile, some very important questions were being raised about de Broglie's wave, chiefly among them, what exactly is it that's waving? This was a deeply perplexing issue because an electron is essentially a point. How does a point wave? Clearly, matter did have the property of waves. Electrons interfere and diffract, so they must be waves, and if they weren't, we wouldn't have electron microscopes. Electron microscopes have far more resolution than normal microscopes do because electrons can be made to have wavelengths that are hundreds of thousands of times shorter than those of visible light, which allows for far greater resolution. And obviously, if electrons have wavelengths, then they must be waves. Yet at the same time, electrons were particles since they could scatter. Waves cannot scatter, particles cannot diffract, and yet electrons can do both. What was going on? So by the mid-1920s, there were a number of serious questions being thrown around, and quantum mechanics appeared to be a disorganized mess of problematic models, troubling challenges to conventional physics paradigms, and no general mathematical framework to unite everything. It was, however, starting to become clear that in order to get an accurate picture of how subatomic particles like electrons behave, one first needs an equation that describes them entirely in terms of their wave properties. Atomic theory would have to be revised yet again in order to accommodate the behaviors of objects with large de Broglie wavelengths. But in the meantime, the questions persisted. What did the de Broglie wave actually represent? What was it describing? What about the duality of light and matter? Are they part of a more general underlying principle of nature? What about the maths? How does one make predictions about the evolution of a quantum system over time? Physicists believed that once these questions were answered, there would be no more mysteries. They thought that as soon as the disparate physical frameworks and contradictory experiments would be resolved, that once a general theory of quantum mechanics would develop under some unified physical principles, that quantum mechanics surely would no longer be strange. They were half correct. When these questions finally did get answered, and when the foundations of quantum mechanics were at long last developed, quantum theory stopped being strange and started to become completely insane.
Okay, so that was the ending of a little documentary presentation, a part 2 of a documentary series on quantum theory made easy by this channel called King Crocoduck. And I was watching this the other day, and part 1 is on the duality of light, part 2 is on the duality of matter, and so that was the end of part 2, and basically he is just walking through the history of quantum mechanics and through the late 1800s and early 20th century. And then he's kind of leaving off right at the point where presumably he gets into Feynman and John Bell and all these kinds of guys. But the wave-particle duality, right, it gets completely insane, and he's showing a picture of Schrodinger's cat in the box there, right? So now we're talking about superposition and wave probabilities and all that. So I was watching these, and he put a lot of work into it. I'm trying to kind of absorb really what the key, not just what the key scientific beliefs are, but what are the philosophical assumptions underneath those beliefs, right? And so this King Crocoduck guy, he's actually a physics postgrad student trying to get his master's in something to do with physics, not quantum physics, but something really, he's obviously had to study a lot about physics. He's obviously thoroughly entrenched in academia. And so I go to try and find part 3, and he hasn't made part 3 yet, so I'm looking at his channel, and I had no idea, but apparently something else he's been doing besides making this series and a couple other series on the science war and different things, is that he's actually debated Kent Hovind 3 different times. And I had no idea. I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with this, but I had no idea. So in 2017, 3 different times he's debated Kent Hovind. This guy is very, definitely has a big bone to pick with creationism, young Earth creationism, and all the pseudoscience that he perceives to be coming out of that. And so I was listening to just a portion of one of these debates, right? And they were talking about the whole distant starlight problem and redshift and the Doppler effect and all that, and they're going back and forth, and it was pretty catty, actually. But it was kind of a bizarre moment, right, where I'm listening to this and hearing a Christian creationist, a guy who at least at one time was sort of one of the premier faces of Christian creationism. I'm not quite sure how he stands in the eyes of, all the other creation ministries and guys like Ken Ham and everything anymore. But so they're going round and round about distant starlight and what, a light year is a distance, it's not a time, and just debating all these things, of course. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, it was just bizarre because to sitting there and be like, to make a list of all the things that they're arguing about, all the false presumptions and all the false alleged scientific facts that they're trying to throw at each other, when really, from our perspective, having kind of had our whole paradigm just like reduced back to almost square one in terms of science versus scientism, so there's no such thing as space, there's no such thing as light years, there's no such thing as presumably really no such thing as a constant for the speed of light, quite possibly no such thing as atomic particles or subatomic particles, no such thing as photons and electrons. And it just made me chuckle to myself to think about, if he has this much disdain for somebody like Kent Hovind, who is still trying to argue from within the parameters of Copernican cosmology and atomic theory, and I'm not negating any of the laws of physics or anything like that, and just so strange, right, to see two people kind of locked in this old modernist kind of face off between classical creationism that is still trying to kind of synthesize itself with so much of alleged scientific knowledge, and then classical atheism. This guy is, he's just sort of your typical Dawkins fanboy intellectual atheist. And if he thinks Kent Hovind is spouting pseudoscience, I can't imagine what he thinks of crazy literalist biblical flat earthers. But it's just funny to me because, I'm really curious what he has to say about the quote-unquote insanity, and that's really what it is. And I think I'm making slow progress in terms of trying to kind of peel back a lot of the noise and a lot of the obfuscation, just break it down to where do they make the circular arguments? We've done this with classical evolutionary theory when it comes to biology, geology, things like this, where, we're able to pinpoint the circular arguments, pinpoint the circular reasoning, where they start off by arguing based off their own assumptions, and sort of go in a circle. So we're kind of familiar with that with a lot of evolutionary paradigms. But when it comes to physics and when it comes to a lot of things that just still creationism doesn't want to even touch that. We don't want to go there. We don't want to question Einstein. We don't want to question particle physics. A lot of people will try and kind of skirt around a lot of the weirdness of quantum physics. Like apparently Danny Faulkner's kind of response to all the insanity of quantum physics is that he chalks it up to the Heisenberg interpretation is where it all went wrong. But really what we're looking at is something that goes obviously way further back. And this is what is so interesting. The more you really look into this, and okay, in cosmology, when you start questioning these things, of course you're going back to all the usual suspects like Galileo and Kepler and Newton. And of course Newton is famous not just for his calculations on the alleged elliptical orbits of the planets and everything, but for all of his work in light. And it's amazing once you start really walking through the history of science from Newton onward and physics, it all really comes back to them starting to try and break down what light is and how it works and what are its properties. All of the the quote-unquote discoveries of atomic theory and subatomic theory, really, it's all about light. So all of the theories that branch off of Newton's first observations and then the hypotheses that were spawned from that, I mean, this is one of the pillars of the cult of scientism. Is light theory, particle light theory. And so after watching all this, I wound up going back and watching a bunch of Ken Wheeler stuff. It'd been a while, but I think Ken Wheeler is onto a lot of things. He's, of course, if you don't know, he's this guy he's a photographer who also has delved into electromagnetism, and he laughs at Einstein and gravity, and the cult of, he's always talking about the cult of atomists, the cult of atomism. And so I think he's really onto a lot of things, but of course he's still then hearkening back to the Greeks and to the ancients and the ancient wisdom, and he's into a lot of esoteric stuff and doesn't know God, right? So you're still trying to kind of reverse engineer everything and unpack everything from a very humanistic standpoint. And that's what I think is interesting when you stop and think about all these things, and when we stop and think about trying to kind of stand up to science and really trying to absorb what that really means from a Christian perspective, from a creationist biblical perspective, where we're always trying to kind of say, well, there's legit science and then there's the pseudoscience and everything. And ultimately, any knowledge that is divorced from the knowledge of God, divorced from the Creator, is going to be a pitfall. It is going to be inevitably a pathway into deception. I was thinking about that verse where Jesus is talking about, I've been thinking about light and optics and all these things, and he's talking about the eye is the lamp of the body. If his eyes are good, his whole body will be full of light. But if that light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? And that's kind of one of those verses where you stop and go, it seems a little weird or a little counterintuitive, I think, but when I was thinking about this verse, while pondering the idea that light, through the perspective of what if light just works totally differently than how mainstream science teaches, that they are not little photons, they are not particles that are actually like going into your eye and that you're absorbing them. Like that's something that Ken Wheeler's always saying, like, at the end of the day I don't have to open my camera and dump all the photons out, right? It sounds stupid, but but you stop and think about it and you go, yeah, it just becomes more absurd the more you think about everything being described in terms of particles, or particles and or waves, this particle wave duality, which is just, it really is ridiculous. The more, to me, that's where so much of the insanity really comes in, and obviously it's by design. There's a reason why they've created this whole, it's really a created problem in some ways. The more you really understand, because they always lay it out in terms of like, well, they're waves, like the waves through a medium. What are the waves of light waving through, right? So they use analogies of like sound and everything, but light is just waving through itself, through particles, but they're behaving like waves themselves. And then they might talk about the ancient theory of the ether, which of course Ken Wheeler definitely believes that there's an ether. I believe that there is something that we might call an ether, although again, from a biblical perspective, these are not necessarily impersonal or abstract things or just fields, but there's more to it than that in a dimensional and spiritual sense. So if that light within you is darkness, just as a metaphor, right? Thinking about it's interesting how much of science and how much of the false scientism that we are just surrounded by is based upon presumptions and philosophical deconstruction of light. What is light? So what a weird analogy, right? That if that light within you is darkness, we could almost say, like, if that body of knowledge, this body of gnosis, this body of science that we as a human race believe that we've compiled and accomplished is lies, is darkness. If the light that is within us all is darkness, how great is that darkness? And of course I keep thinking back to Genesis 1, and the first thing that God made was light. Let there be light. And so, it's not surprising that it would factor so centrally to this whole great deception, to this whole scientific evolutionary mystery Babylon deception, that it would start with taking light and making that sort of one of the most central components of this twisted knowledge and this false Luciferian sort of development. But yeah, listening to Kent Hovind now, like years ago, I probably would have thought he was doing a really good job and was really smart, and he's able to quote back the science from from the mainstream and sort of battle. But now it just looks silly, where you're both locked in paradigms of absolute nonsense and trying to just throwing lies at each other, throwing like this contest to see who has a better grasp of the pseudoscience than the other person. It's just bizarre. And it also kind of reminds me of something else that I came across recently. Speaking of debates and creationism, Ken Ham and Jason Lyle were debating with this guy Hugh Ross and another guy. And so they were debating over, young earth creationism. And Hugh Ross is this Christian. He's a creationist astronomer who holds to the Big Bang theory. And they're talking about, what does Genesis mean by the term day? Does day mean a literal 24-hour day in every instance, or is it metaphorical and everything? And it was just a bizarre irony once again, because the things that you hear Hugh Ross and these guys saying is the exact same thing about, the Bible is not always meant to be literal, and it's metaphor, it's allegory, it's poetry. Jesus didn't always say. Jesus said, "I am a door." Does that mean that Jesus is a door? And they're saying this to the young Earth creationists, who then, ironically, turn around and make the exact same excuses and arguments to the enclosed cosmology folks, to the flat earthers, saying, "Oh, you're taking that too literally, don't you know?" I mean, it's just bizarre. So again, it's like two people kind of still fighting because they're both still clinging to space and still clinging to so many assumed, scientific facts about the way physics works, about the way, again, light. I mean, so many of these arguments that we have are based on presumptions that we even know what light is or electromagnetism is. And the bottom line is that we don't. We do not even know what it is. All these things that we have that are descriptions of it are still not definitions of light. So we can harness it in all kinds of ways. We can experiment with it. We can quantify effects and come up with, hertz and joules and kelvins and all these metrics by which to measure the effects of light and heat and magnetism and wavelengths and so on and so forth. But still, that's all we're doing is creating our own metrics to measure effects within the physical world, and then coming up with these models to try and describe, like, what is light? What is it made out of? And to me, that seems like really a central piece of the whole. We were talking earlier about, my last video was talking about the quantum abyss and trying to, this never-ending pit of trying to kind of break down everything and go deeper and deeper. And well, what is that made of? Well, what is that made of? Well, how does, and that it's just sort of this never-ending downward spiral. And, who knows if there are little building blocks to elements of the world we live in. It's not that I'm rejecting that idea entirely, but the thing about this cult of atomism and quantum theory and everything is that it meshes energy and matter together. It meshes light. Really what they're saying, because when they say that electrons are orbiting around the nucleuses of all atoms, right, which is supposedly matter, the physical stuff, so there's light in everything, and it's ultimately indistinguishable, which I don't think scripturally you can make a very compelling case for that light is something that can be transmuted into matter, and matter into light or energy or electromagnetism or whatever you want to call it. This whole, the concept of relativity. I mean, when we think about in Genesis 1, where light is created first, before there's any light source, before the sun, moon, and stars, I don't know exactly what that means in terms of the implications for what light actually is, but I do think it's rather significant, right? That it's this thing, it's part of the creation, but also how much God uses it as this analogy for himself, I am the light of the world. And John 1, hang on, I'm going to read John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, which is one of the prime biblical proofs for the reality of the Trinity, by the way. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. And there was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but he sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was not in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them he gave power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bare witness of him, and cried, saying, This was he of whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness have all we received, and grace for grace. And so obviously, some people might think that that is a little strange to talk about that verse in the context of, a quote-unquote scientific discussion of light. But the more I think about these things, the more I think maybe that's a lot of our problem, is that we have kind of been, I'm speaking in generically as Christians over history, sort of compartmentalized these approaches, talking about things like light as just a physical property, as just a physical thing that can be studied and analyzed and broken down and described in all of its constituent parts and effects and everything. And then light is in the Bible as this allegorized, spiritual, poetic type thing. Is that really justified? And I don't know that it, I mean, you don't see anyone in Scripture talking about the physical world, talking about whether it's light or the heavens and the earth or sound or whatever, and trying to break it down and do experiments and quantify it and capture it in formulas and tables and things. And like I said before, from Scripture we see that it's inseparable from the person of God, from the Creator. Trying to just, and this is really what science, the underlying philosophical assumption of all false science, is that it starts with man. It starts with us as our own starting point. There's no room for divine revelation. And it's it's interesting because that video that came out like a week or two ago by Jason A, right, where he finally put something out on the flat earth, and he just played this horrendous clip by whoever this southern pastor guy is, and he's talking about why the Bible doesn't preach the flat earth and all this stuff, and don't you know that there's different genres of the Bible and everything. I mean, it was just really sad. But he made this comment in there that I've been thinking about ever since I heard it, how it's like, which we hear all the time. We hear this all the time about the Bible is not a science book, And it's true that the Bible is not a science book. Genesis is not a science book. Genesis is a history book, according to those who believe in the Bible, according to Jesus, who quoted from Genesis and quoted it as historical fact. But it's history that was not compiled through some sort of empirical endeavor. It was not compiled by men going out and making observations and writing them down and compiling them through humanistic scientific endeavor. No human was there for those first days of creation when God made light and then separated it from darkness, when God created the expanse that separated the waters above from the waters below, and then all of this was given to humanity by God. We had no way of knowing. It's not science at all, in the sense of what we think of when we say science in terms of the scientific method, the empirical, use of observation and experimentation and validation and everything, repeatability. It's just all out the window. It's revelation. And so that is our starting point as believers. And so really, if you really boil it down, the difference between Christians, I mean, do as Christians, do we do science? Is science a valid thing? I think, this is kind of an interesting question in terms of like, well, where do you draw lines? I mean, even little children do experimentation and exploration and observation, when they're growing up. But there's also revelation from your parents and from the people around you. You don't just go put a child in the woods. I was listening to this weird video somebody made about Neil deGrasse Tyson, where Neil is talking about how children are natural little scientists, and they go out and they observe and they experiment and everything. But yeah, they're not just left out on their own, and neither are we. And so while, I mean, even something as simple as like if you're walking in the wilderness and you came across a big deep hole and you can't even see the bottom, and you drop a rock into the hole just to listen and hear and try and get an idea of how deep that thing is. That's a scientific experiment in a very crude, basic way. And obviously, learning how to build houses and tools and things like this. I mean, these are not unbiblical or wrong, but really, where do you see God? I mean, really, the biggest engineering project that we see God sponsoring in Scripture is the construction of the temple, right? Where all these workers were brought in from different, with David who started it, and then Solomon, and all of that. But then, now that the temple was ultimately destroyed, and now we know that that was just a foreshadowing and a copy of what is in heaven, and that God's the one who's actually building the New Jerusalem, the city in heaven that is going to come down. It does make you go, like, how much of what we still are continuing to do, we've still continued to do ever since Jesus raised from the dead and went back to heaven, has just been vanity and humanistic endeavor, is a really prickly question for a lot of Christians in the world, especially creationist Christians who want to point to NASA, and they want to quote physics, and they want to quote science. And we're all in this process of sort of trying to unwind that and trying to like sort of deprogram ourselves. And all of us who are sort of in this place of processing what this means, that there's really no curvature, and the Bible doesn't talk about a Copernican universe at all, and sort of process all these implications. Or what if there really is no such thing as atoms, at least not in the way that they claim, all these subatomic particles and electrons and photons jumping around, and which then has even more implications. It really is a domino effect. Once you start questioning electrons, well, then it's like, well, that, like he says in that video, the electron microscope, we know that because of the photoelectric effect. Well, how much do we really know? How much has really been, I mean, it has implications for the pharmaceutical industry, that whole monopoly and nightmare. It's all based on being able to patent things based on molecular models, which are combinations of atoms. Things like DNA and genetics and all. I mean, really, everything is back on the table. Everything is subject to deeper scrutiny and deeper evaluation. And it's not saying that it's like everything that they have come up with, or everything that they have observed or quantified in some way, or figured out a new technology based on that it's all a hoax. It just means that it's sort of like built-in compartmentalization. It's a built-in fragmenting in order to continue pushing along. And this is another Ken Wheeler thing that I'm going to steal, but he talks about the blind guys touching the elephant. So when he's talking about wave particle duality, right? And one's touching an ear, and he's like, oh, it's like a flat like a pancake, and others touching a trunk, and it's like a snake, and but they're all clueless to what they're really touching. And a lot of people use that metaphor for religion and spirituality, and how trying to make this syncretistic argument, but never mind, which I don't agree with. But in this sense, in the scientism sense, or the physics sense, it's a pretty good analogy. To where I think there is something to that, to where the fact that they go, oh, in this case it's behaving like a particle, in this case it's behaving like a wave. They probably are observing a legitimate effect, but the model is still insufficient. The model is still contradictory. That's what the word duality is really just sort of this PC way of saying a total self-contradiction, but one that they are determined to embrace nonetheless and make it work and force, and that's what and then it becomes deeper insanity. This whole thing with with Schrodinger's cat and superposition and this idea that it's both at the same time. It's a wave and a particle, and that we have to use probability in order to describe something in reality, which is, to me, it's a key part of this whole philosophical, cliff jump, where it really, which is, for whatever reason, that's what they want to do, where it's designed to take people and go, yep, you can, even though it's totally illogical and totally counterintuitive, you have to embrace this idea of superposition and probabilistic reality. And that's what I mean by, I think they're using mathematical language and specifically this concept of probabilities to kind of construct and promote these higher dimensional concepts, which are ultimately higher spiritual dimensional concepts, to the public, and get them to kind of understand, to normalize and embrace this idea that there are dimensions that we can't see, that are counterintuitive, that are seemingly contradictory and yet real all the time. But then they always have that caveat that it's only on the quantum level, right? But everything is made up of quanta, supposedly. Everything is made up of subatomic particles. So it really is this seed, or this Trojan horse for ideas of mysticism and occultism and New Age spirituality. And this is another thing that just to close, looking at his channel, this King Crocoduck. So he's debating Kent Hovind and just thinks Kent Hovind's the biggest idiot of all time. But then he's lamenting the Christian, he's lamenting the creationists, and talking smack about the PhDs that the creationists have are they haven't even published any papers, and they're just he's not impressed by their academic credibility. But then at the same time, he's also making videos lamenting this rise of what he calls the Lysenkoists, which is based off this Russian guy. Basically, this anti-science movement amongst people, and to where the quantum woo and Deepak Chopra and all these kind of, so yeah, hating Kent Hovind on the one hand and Deepak Chopra on the other. And ultimately, it's kind of just, it makes me laugh, because you see this whole old paradigm of the staunch materialistic atheist as really this dying breed. And, guys like Kent Hovind and Ken Ham, that's who they kind of have been fixing their rebuttals and their arguments and stuff against for decades. But because they believe that so much of these foundations that science is built on are still valid, all the atomistic and all the basic physics assumptions and Einstein and all that, they still hold to all that and won't question so many things that these crazy flat earthers will question. They can't see, just like the materialistic atheists can't see, that it really is this back door, that it really is this segue into mysticism and into spirit science and into stuff that they both would probably turn around and attack. So that's the irony, right? Is that materialism ultimately falls flat. And even at the beginning of one of these debates, Kent actually, the one good thing I heard him say was, he was like, why do you even care? Like, why are you even upset about all these stupid creationists and all these people who are scientifically wrong, quote unquote, if in fact everything's an accident, and you'd believe in scientific materialism, and so you believe in this totally deterministic universe, there's no such thing as God, there's no such thing as souls, there's no spirit, the very definition of what you and me are, like, who are you, what are you, do you even have your own independent mind and thought and consciousness, or are you just this collection of atoms and molecules and cosmic forces all just kind of knocking into each other and making sounds and living and dying, and it's all meaningless, it's all just random combinations of matter and energy, right? Why do you care? How does that question even have any meaning if you reduce everything down to this materialistic universe? And that's a totally valid question that sort of works as the virus from within, that's gnawing evolution from the inside out, right? Those gnawing questions of meaning, purpose, consciousness. Materialism cannot answer that. I mean, like in Crocoduck, he just didn't say anything. What can you say? Why? You can't explain the why. So you have those staunch, Dawkins-esque atheists who are just very angry at God and angry at the Bible and angry at, presumably, probably angry at religious people and Christians and their perceptions and experiences more than even God himself. God is just a projection of all these people that they hate and oppression and everything. But they can't explain it. They don't have their own explanation for meaning or purpose or consciousness. And so that's the vacuum. It's hollowed out from the inside. So people still believe in evolution as like, well, it's a scientific fact. It's been demonstrated and blah, blah, blah. But they have to ascribe meaning to it. They're still hungry for meaning. They're still hungry for purpose. They're still hungry for, they're still desiring to explain what is consciousness. Why am I really me and not just a collection of atoms and molecules and energy and matter? But I really am something or someone. Am I part of a bigger something or someone or bigger those questions just remain unanswered by materialism. And as people continue to reject the divine revelation that God has given, through his prophets and through his Son, they will inevitably continue seeking answers in the light that is not light, the light that is darkness. Instead of embracing the person of God and the person of Jesus Christ as the light, as the answer, as that which illuminates everything, they want to understand the light themselves and break it down. And so you can do that in the classical materialistic way with atomism and quantum physics and just get more and more contradictory and more insane. Or then that can bleed over into a mystical and esoteric approach, and then you're just like Ken Wheeler going back into the wisdom of the ancients and the Greeks and the Vedas and the Babylonians and all that. And we see this more and more. I mean, I stole some of these clips at the beginning from this show from BBC Two called The Code, right? And it's the presenter is this guy who's he believes in evolution, he believes in materialistic science on the one hand, but at the same time, the whole premise of the show is like trying to find all the patterns and the codes that are inherent in nature, and somehow by piecing this all together, right, that we can kind of get down to the core essence of how evolution works and how all the matter and energy in the universe organizes itself, right, according to patterns and efficiencies and the ratios and everything else. Which again is this whole fractal idea. So it's bleeding more. So materialistic science, despite what poor guys like Crocoduck want to maintain, it's like the footing is getting washed away underneath their feet. Even in the mainstream, in the universities, in all the major figureheads and prophets of scientism and everything is all sinking back down into the occult roots that it all came out of in the first place. So thanks for watching. Hope that made sense. Talk to you later.